Mr. Scott.
Good morning, my lady. May we please call Catherine Todd, who can be sworn.
Mr. Todd, if you could repeat after me, please. I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Ms. Todd, thank you so much for joining us this morning. I know how difficult this must be for you. Probably something that you don't want to relive, but it is so important that we do hear from you, so I'm really grateful to you.
Thanks.
Miss Todd, I'd like to ask you some questions about the experiences of you and your partner TJ around the very sad death of your son Ziggy on the 21st of July 2021, a few hours after he was born. It's right that Ziggy was your first child,
Yeah, he was.
and are you happy if I refer to him as Ziggy throughout?
Yeah, that's fine.
On the 12th of July 2021, you were approaching 28 weeks pregnant, is that right?
Yeah, that's great.
You'd been due to attend a routine scan, but you tested positive for COVID. So you called the hospital's maternity unit. What did they do as a result of that call?
When I first phoned and reported to maternity that I was COVID positive, they had cancelled a scan that was upcoming.
Did they give you any guidance or advice about what to do or things to look out for as a pregnant lady with COVID?
No, not at that time.
You started to feel very unwell, but you also became aware that Ziggy wasn't moving the way that he had been. What did you do as a result of that?
I'd phoned maternity, both the EOU and the advice line, multiple times. Their advice really at the time was just to take paracetamol and lie on my side for 2 hours and drink a fizzy drink.
That seems fairly normal advice you get for a pregnant lady who's suffering from reduced fetal movements. Were you being told anything above and beyond that because
No.
you had COVID? And for how many days did you call?
I think I first phoned maybe on the 12th or the 13th, sorry, maybe, to say that I had COVID, and then up until Siggy was born, so up until the 20th, I had an ambulance out as well to our house in between the phone calls.
Mr. Scott, can you pause that? I'm not sure if anybody else is having some problems following the audio. And is it just me? Looks like it's just me. Nobody else is nodding. So I'll look at the transcript.
Well, you're quite important, my lady, so if there's anything that we can do to make
I've
that
got the
better.
transcript. And I think as long as the stenographer can hear properly, that's fine. I'm so sorry to have interrupted, Mr. Todd.
What advice will you be given in those first few days, so the 12th, the 13th, the 14th, when you were calling the maternity unit?
Every time it was really the same, just lie on my side and to phone back if I had any other concerns.
Did you ask for Ziggy to be checked?
Yeah.
And what did they say?
They told me that they wouldn't bring me in at the time because they wanted to reduce the risk of spread of COVID.
And how did that make you feel?
Not reassured at all.
Do you think that you should have been examined sooner than you were?
Yeah, definitely.
Do you think that you would have been seen earlier if you didn't have COVID?
Yeah.
And it came to the point that you took yourself to hospital on the 16th of July, is that right?
I had phoned them a few times on the 16th. Again, they gave me the same advice, just to lie on the side, drink a fizzy drink, take paracetamol. But a few hours later, nothing had changed. So I phoned back again and said that I was coming up for the hospital to check Ziggy.
What made you take the decision to go up?
I just felt at that time it had gone on too long, and I was just getting the same advice and nothing was changing every time I was phoning.
And when you went up, it's right that you were 27 weeks and 6 days pregnant that day, is that right? Yeah. And when you went up, you have a partner, TJ, that's right?
Yeah.
Did TJ go with you?
He wasn't allowed into the hospital. He had to park outside, and they brought me through an ambulance bay just to be seen.
Were you told when, at any point, TJ may be allowed in while you were in there?
I was told that he wasn't allowed in at all.
And when you were in, you didn't receive a full, I'm going to call it a CTG scan, but you received a Doppler scan, so just a normal scan to listen to the baby's heartbeat, is that right?
Yeah, just a Doppler.
Was the midwife who carried out that scan wearing PPE?
I think she was. It was the sister that had seen me. Although after she'd done the Doppler, she had told me to go back and wait in the car, that she needed to do a handover. She'd been there from 7:30 that morning, and that I was fine and Siggy was fine. And while I was waiting in the car for my notes to be brought out, she actually came out in her own clothes.
How long were you waiting in your car for?
Maybe about 5 minutes after the Doppler was done.
How did you feel being asked to leave the maternity unit and go and wait in your car before you got your notes?
Like I was just rushed in and out the door. No one really wanted to see me.
You provided a review of the circumstances of Ziggy's death. One of the points that's considered in that review is about the decision not to give you a CTG scan.
Yeah.
And please do correct me if I'm wrong, but is it right that the guidance that was in place at the time for the hospital was that assessment of fetal heart rate by CTG was from 28 weeks onwards?
Yeah, that's correct.
And because you were 27 weeks and 6 days, a CTG was not performed?
Yeah.
Were you asked to come back the next day when you would have been at 28 weeks?
No. I was just sent home and told that I was fine, and that Ziggy was fine.
Were you told what to do if you still had concerns about Ziggy's movements or lack of them?
No.
So, just sorry to interrupt again. Mr. Todd, what was it about Ziggy that made you feel that you'd had to go to hospital? What was it about the baby that made you think that something might be wrong?
Reduced. And then I had also noticed my bump getting quite a lot smaller.
So I don't think the sonographer heard. What reduced? Was that the movement of the baby? Was it Ziggy's movement? So Ziggy's movement reduced and you thought your bump was smaller, so you thought he was smaller?
Yeah.
And when you went in on the 16th of July, for how many days had you been concerned about reduced movements from Ziggy?
Maybe from the 14th onwards.
Just if I can come back to the review about that in relation to the scan. It's also noted that the impact of maternal COVID-19 was not fully understood and led to this not being recognised as an independent risk factor when assessing reduced fetal movement. This resulted in you not having a CTG recording when you attended on the 16th of July 2021. And it continued, at the time of the review, limited information was available about the effects of COVID-19 during pregnancy, particularly the strain of virus which was prevalent in Northern Ireland during the summer months of 2021. They were not obvious within the obstetric teams in Northern Ireland until late August, early September 2021. How did you feel about that finding when you read it?
Very let down. Don't know why it took even past a year into the pandemic for them to have anything really in place for maternity.
In July 2021, had you heard there being concerns about risks associated with COVID during pregnancy?
Not really, no.
What's your thoughts about not being offered a CTG scan? How's that had a lasting impact upon you?
I think that if they had have done the CTG, they possibly would have picked things up and things could have been completely different.
Do you feel that you were able to ask or insist or press for a CTG scan?
No. As I say, I felt like I was rushed in and out. No one really wanted me in the hospital for a start, obviously because it was COVID positive. So I think at the time they were just trying to get me out as quick as they could.
Do you think the situation might have been different if you'd been allowed to have TJ or anyone else in with you?
Yeah.
So moving ahead about 3 days later, you were having difficulty breathing and you were having heart palpitations. How concerned at that point were you for both yourself and for Ziggy?
Extremely concerned. I actually ended up phoning my GP the following day from having the ambulance out, because when the ambulance did come out, they just checked me, but not Ziggy. And I was at the time I was kind of up and down. 1 minute it was okay, and then breathing wise, and then the next minute breathing wasn't great. I think maybe it had taken the ambulance about 5 hours or so to come out. But the following day my breathing had got worse, and I just felt like the hospital and when the ambulance came out, they hadn't really done much. So the following day is whenever I'd phoned my GP.
Can I just take those in steps? So what were you concerned about with Ziggy that led to, I think it was TJ who called the ambulance, wasn't it?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So what were your concerns about Ziggy that led to the ambulance being called?
Well, I'd obviously noticed his movements reducing, and then the sicker I was feeling, it was concerning me more that the two of us were really unwell at that point.
And I think you said it was 5 hours?
Yeah, I think it was around there.
And that was for the ambulance to arrive from the time it was called?
Mm-hmm.
And it arrived about 1 or 2 a.m., is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
And you said earlier on that when the ambulance arrived, they didn't check the baby. Do you remember anything about why the paramedics didn't check on Ziggy?
No, they didn't tell me why. They just basically done my oxygen levels and blood pressure, and that was it.
Did you tell them about your concerns about Ziggy's lack of movements?
Yeah, I was more so phoning for him than me at that point.
Were you given any advice or guidance about what you should do?
No, just the same thing again, take paracetamol and lie down.
So you were told to lie down. That was from the paramedics, you were told to lie down when they just checked you?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
This was on the 16th of July, so you'd already been in this for a few days at this point, 4 or 5 days. What was your state of mind at that time when the paramedics left?
I think being checked by both the sister in EOU and the ambulance, I was kind of thinking at the time maybe everything was okay, as that's what they were telling me. And just to kind of to trust them when, and I know that I shouldn't have, I should have kind of pushed it further.
Did you feel looked after?
No.
So you said earlier on that you called the GP about midday, so that was about 11 hours or so after the ambulance had arrived. Could you tell us, please, what the GP said to you?
She said to go straight to A&E, and that she was going to fax over that I was coming so that they definitely had to see me.
Did she think that you might not be seen if she hadn't informed them that you were coming?
I think so. I think she also had faxed it over so I kind of wouldn't have been waiting as long. But I don't really think it made a difference because obviously I was in A&E then waiting for maybe about 10 hours.
So you said you went to A&E and you just said you were waiting in A&E for 10 hours?
Yeah.
Was that 10 hours until you were seen or 10 hours until you left or?
10 hours in A&E in total until I was moved over to maternity. I think about 5 hours in, obstetrics came down and scanned me. I seen Siggy and stuff moving then at the time.
Well, sorry, Todd, I don't want to jump ahead too quickly. I will definitely get there with you. I just want to talk about your waiting experience in A&E. You say that you were placed in what seemed to be a waiting area for people with COVID, but it also seemed to be used for people with suspected COVID. What made you think that?
There was a man who was shouting everywhere about how he wasn't COVID positive. I think he was maybe up for like an asthmatic problem, and they had just grouped his symptoms together basically and put him in the COVID area of A&E.
So it was July 2021. Was there any kind of funneling system or areas for people to wait depending on any kind of COVID status?
They, at the A&E that I was in, they had, so the normal waiting room of A&E was people that they didn't suspect to have COVID. Then they had a door that was like locked and security, and beyond that door was just everyone with either COVID positive or they had COVID symptoms.
And was that where you were because you had the positive test?
Yeah.
Okay. So you just said that in A&E that they scanned Ziggy and that you could see him moving. Were you given the results of that scan?
No.
What were you told?
That he was fine. But their concern at the time was a deranged liver function test that was done on me, but they had no concerns really for Siggy.
You talk about how that you thought that the staff were all called into a meeting.
Yeah.
Did you feel that everything was fine with Ziggy at that point?
I did, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, were you taken from A&E round to the maternity ward?
Yeah, a midwife actually came down with a wheelchair to take me round to maternity from A&E, but that was another 5 hours after he was scanned.
Was TJ with you at any point in this?
No, he wasn't allowed in.
Where was he? Was he in the car park or somewhere else? Or
At home, we only live maybe like 5 minutes from the hospital, so he stayed at home.
When you were scanned around in the maternity ward, how many people were at that scan?
Maybe about 4 or 5.
And what were you told were the results of that scan?
That Siggy had very little amniotic fluid around him, and they were going to take me for an emergency section.
Did you have a chance to talk to TJ at that time?
Oh, I just texted him really quickly, and then they had prepped me for the section.
Just before you go on, Ms. Todd, just before the prep, because you talk about the alarms going off.
Yeah.
How long were you left after the alarms went off?
An hour.
Were you told what was happening?
No, no one came in at all.
How did you feel about being left in that situation?
Really unsafe.
Why do you think that there was a delay in carrying out that emergency C-section?
We had a meeting maybe December time with a few of the staff, and they had told me the delay was because there was another baby that had, I think, an 80% survival rate, whereas at the time Siggy only had 10, so they chose basically to go in with the other baby.
Do you think that there was enough staff there to be able to treat you and to give Ziggy an early C-section?
No, not at all.
Did anybody contact TJ to tell him what was happening at this time?
No, he actually contacted the hospital a few times himself. The first time, I think he was told if I needed him that I would phone him, to which he replied, if she's in having a section, she'll not have her phone. And then he phoned another 2 times, I think, and they told him to stop ringing, and that it wasn't his information to know.
Did anybody else try and contact?
Yeah, my mum and my eldest sister, and they were told the same thing.
So did anybody know when you actually went in to have the C-section?
No.
When was TJ allowed in?
I had the section and then brought back up to a room, so it wasn't until later that night, a few hours maybe after Siggy was born.
Obviously, how did TJ feel in that time between when he found out that you were having a C-section and when he was actually allowed to see you?
I think he was very anxious. He was at home with no information of what was going on. He was completely left in the dark.
What happened to Ziggy after you'd had the C-section?
I know when he was first born, he had a very low APGAR score. So they had him basically in the corner with the team for the NICU. They had done CPR and then taken him up to neonatal intensive care.
Did you have a chance to see him?
No.
So when he was in the neonatal unit, did you have an opportunity, or put that a different way, did the nursing staff try and help you and TJ see Ziggy over that night?
They tried to bring us round a few times during the night, but they didn't explain that they were bringing us round. They were just kind of putting me in full PPE and into a wheelchair, and then the next minute I was back. They were getting me back out of the wheelchair, and the PPE was off again.
What room, were you in a room or were you in a ward at that time?
I was in a private, like a side room. I think it's actually the bereavement room. It's in the hospital.
So you didn't have to be in PPE in there?
No.
And was TJ allowed to be in with you there?
Yeah.
Was he allowed to be in there with you all night, or did he have to leave?
He, as soon as he came into the hospital, he stayed with me then in the room. We actually had a midwife who came in and sat on, this was after Siggy had passed, sat on the floor and told him that he wasn't allowed to leave. He basically said he hadn't left, and she said, that's fine, you shouldn't even be here, or we've already bent over backwards for you, you shouldn't even be here.
How did it help you to have TJ with you that night before Ziggy passed away?
I think it was more so the support, because I hadn't been given that option the whole time of, Siggy's movements reducing. He wasn't allowed into any scans, and then again in A&E. So I think it was more so the support, and he obviously was in the same boat that I was at the time. No one was telling us anything, so it was just the two of us kind of talking with each other.
Did you know how unwell Ziggy was that night?
At the start, they'd said that he was really unwell. But then later on, one of the midwives had made a comment that his obs had been picking up. That was just before we were brought round to meet him. So we actually thought that he was getting better, a good bit better, before we'd been brought round to see him the next day.
Do you think the fact that you were COVID positive had anything to do with the amount of information that you were being given about Ziggy's condition overnight?
Yeah, I think they were trying not to come in and out of the room as much as probably what they would have if I wasn't COVID positive.
Were you or TJ receiving any food and drink, for example?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You went round and saw Ziggy, was it about 8:30, 9 o'clock the following morning?
Yeah.
What did you think Ziggy's condition was before you saw him?
As I say, the midwife had stated that his obs were starting to pick up, so we thought we were being brought round to meet him as he was getting better. We weren't told at the time that he was on palliative care or anything.
What did you find how was Ziggy when you went in?
He was basically in an incubator, in a private NICU room that actually overlooked the main neonatal. There was a window so people could see in, and we could see in there. But he had all the medical equipment on, basically, and when we came in, they had taken him off everything. Again, we thought that he was getting a lot better at that point, that they were able to remove everything.
When did you find out that wasn't the case?
But they took everything off and then handed Ziggy over to me, and then they just left the room, and then he passed away, and they didn't come back for maybe about another 2 hours.
Was that the first time that you'd been with Ziggy since he was born?
Yeah.
And was that the only time that TJ got to see Ziggy?
Yeah.
And were you having to wear full PPE when you were with him?
Yeah, I had the full PPE. We had hairnets, masks, a visor, a full apron, gloves, and I think shoe coverings.
What did you think about being asked to wear PPE to visit Ziggy?
I thought it was unnecessary, especially at the time. They knew how unwell he was. We didn't. So now looking at it, I'm a bit confused as to why we were in full PPE, because if they knew that he was being taken off life support, I don't understand who the PPE was protecting. Also, he was in a private infection room. So again, I don't think it was necessary to have full PPE.
Did wearing PPE, does that have a lasting impact upon your memories of your time with Ziggy?
Yeah, all of our photos that we have with him are in full PPE.
How long were you with Ziggy for?
We were, after he had passed, as I say, they left us in that room for about 2 hours before they came back, and then they brought us back to the bereavement room. And I think, I'm not sure, but I think they possibly had like washed him and stuff. We weren't given the option again to do that, and then they brought him round to the bereavement room.
In those 2 hours, did anyone come in and see you?
No.
You said earlier on that in the room that Ziggy was in, you could be seen from the outside.
Yep.
Was there a curtain or a screen or anything that was put up?
Nothing. I think only after the SAI was done, because it was something that I highlighted, as there was another baby that was on the opposite side of the window, and the baby's dad, but I assume it was the baby's dad, was able to watch everything.
You stayed in hospital for some days afterwards. How much time was TJ able to spend with you?
He stayed with me the whole time then in that room.
How beneficial was that for both of you, that you were able to spend time together?
Really important. I think also it was really the only time that we got with Siggy. So it was very important.
And you mentioned earlier on about the midwife coming over and saying, you can't be leaving this room, we've bent over backwards for you. Is that 2 days after Ziggy had passed away?
Yeah. He was actually on my chest at the time.
What was your overall view of the compassion that you and TJ and Ziggy received from the staff at that time? I don't think there was any at all. I don't think anyone cared. I think they were too busy. They were rushing in and out of the room and just didn't really care. Do you think they knew what to do, how to cope with COVID and pregnant people at that time?
No, not at all.
Do you think there was enough staff to be able to look after everyone in the maternity unit at that time?
No.
Were you offered any help with bereavement or grief while you were in hospital?
I later learned that leaving the hospital, we were supposed to have a bereavement midwife as we were leaving, which we didn't hear from until I think it was 2 weeks later. And she actually contacted TJ to tell him funeral arrangements that we had made.
You were told that Ziggy was to be sent for a post-mortem.
Yeah.
And do you know that, well, his body was going to have to be collected to be taken to a hospital in Liverpool for a post-mortem, is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
And do you know the reason for that?
No.
Had anyone ever told you whether there was anyone actually in Northern Ireland capable of carrying out a post-mortem on a child at that time?
No. That was really our only option, was that he went to Alderhay. And they, in the bereavement room, they brought round like a DVD to watch of stages basically and what would happen, from time frames to like who would be with him, and but obviously that didn't happen either.
How important was it to you to know where Ziggy was at all times in that trip to and from Liverpool?
Extremely important.
And were you kept informed about where he was?
No, not at all. We were told that he would be picked up from the Ulster on the Monday and back on the Wednesday. When in turn it came to the Monday, I had heard nothing at all, so I contacted the hospital myself, and they basically said they didn't know where he was. He wasn't there. They suggested that I contact the Royal Mortuary. So when I done that, they weren't sure where he was either, and they told me to maybe phone over to Liverpool. So I'd phoned Liverpool maybe that night, and again, I got a guy on the phone who wasn't too sure. He said he didn't think there was any babies that had come over from Belfast, until the next morning. A lady from the Snowflakes team had contacted me to let me know that he wasn't there. And she'd stayed in contact with me, but then she phoned me again on the Wednesday morning. Following Tuesday night, she had told me that there was 2 babies coming from Belfast, but they didn't know their names until they got there. So she phoned me maybe at about 6 o'clock Wednesday morning to let me know that he had arrived in Liverpool. So he had basically been in the Ulster the entire time.
So, is it right that it was about 2 days where you didn't know where Ziggy was?
Yeah.
What did you think of the level of contact that you'd had from the hospital in Northern Ireland?
I thought it was appalling.
Were you able to have an open coffin for Ziggy?
In the end, but very nearly no. The Ulster had put on maternal COVID on his death certificate, and as a result, the funeral director's policy was that they wouldn't then be able to manage his body. And it was only from the lady actually that was working in the Snowflakes team over in Liverpool. She had phoned me just to see if we had a cuddle cot. And at the time I didn't even know what that was.
Could you just explain quickly what a cuddle cot is?
It's like a small Moses basket type shape device that keeps the baby cold, so you can spend more time with them.
How important was it to you at that time to spend time with Ziggy?
Extremely important.
How long?
Sorry, just because we'd even been told that it was going to be a closed coffin, you know, it was really important to us that we got to make memories that we could.
How long did it take for you to be given a cuddle cot?
When he came home, he was due to be home with the funeral directors, and because the lady from Snowflakes team had phoned, everything kind of had to be delayed, so we could arrange with the hospital to collect a cuddle cot. And I think, if I remember correctly, I think TJ actually had to go up and collect it himself.
And you're talking about an open coffin. Is it right that it was only when the funeral home were told that Ziggy had a negative PCR test that you were able to have an open coffin?
Yeah. So the lady from Snowflakes team was the one who organised it all. She phoned round the Ulster from Liverpool to ask if he had a PCR. Now, we were never asked or give consent for him to have a PCR done, but basically that's the only reason why. Is she then obtained it from the Ulster, and then she contacted the funeral directors as well to let them know that Ziggy's PCR was done by the hospital and it was negative.
This was a Snowflakes team. This is in Liverpool. It's not a Northern Ireland service, is that right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
How did you feel about the level of communication that you'd received about the cuddle cot, about the PCR that would allow you to have an open coffin?
Well, there wasn't any communication. You know, everything was done either by us or from another service that's not in Northern Ireland.
And is it right that after Ziggy's death and after the funeral arrangements, you tried to get access to the records that were held about you and about Ziggy? How easy was it to get access to those records?
Extremely difficult. We phoned and phoned, and a lady actually told TJ she wasn't so sure why I wanted them, even to begin with. And he said he had replied to her saying, it doesn't matter why she wants them, but if it helps her sleep, then what's the issue that she's given them? And basically, then we were given half. We weren't given the full medical notes. We were only given half of them, and I think it was a few days even for them to photocopy that out. We've never actually received our own the green file. It's just been a photocopy.
Do you think it was a battle to get those notes?
Yeah.
Just want to ask about your overall impressions, Ms. Todd. When you look back on all of your experiences in that period in July 2021, do you think that there were enough staff to treat you at that time?
No.
Do you think that the staff knew how to treat a pregnant woman with COVID back in 2021?
No.
Did you feel safe as a pregnant lady in Northern Ireland?
Not at all. No.
It's right that you're pregnant now, isn't it?
Yeah.
Do you feel safe as a pregnant lady in Northern Ireland now?
No.
Did you feel listened to by medical staff in 2021?
No.
You've since given birth, as you say. Is it right that some of those who've been involved in your time with Ziggy arrived at your bedside at the time when your child was born?
Yeah.
How did that impact upon your experience with her?
I don't think it was necessary at all. I also was admitted the majority of my pregnancy with my second, and had people that were dealing with the SAI with Ziggy at the time come round to see me while I was admitted with my second, which again I don't think there was any need for.
How has your experiences made you feel towards the healthcare system in Northern Ireland?
I don't have much hope in it.
And just finally, how are you now?
Not great. It's obviously something that's completely impacted the rest of our lives. And I think we have just been left to deal with it ourselves. We're kind of away from the hospital now, and that's all that that matters to them. We're out the door, and we're the ones left with this for the rest of our lives, basically.
Thank you, Ms. Todd. My lady, I have no further questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms. Todd. I do hope we haven't added to your trauma and your grief. No one can ever replace Ziggy, and I know that you and his father will never forget him, and you'll always miss him. I just hope that the new baby and your daughter can help you come to terms with the grief that I'm afraid is going to be with you forever. But thank you so much, and best of luck with the new baby.
Thank you.
Right, I think we'll take a break now, Ms. Todd. There may be some people who wish to speak with you, so Ms. Campbell and others may just come and repeat the thanks, I suspect, that I've already given. And we'll take a short break and then we'll come back to the next witness. Thank you again.
All right.
Ms. Carey.
My lady, before we call the next witness, can I deal with one matter? You've just heard now from 4 witnesses who are giving evidence on behalf of the bereaved groups from across the UK. And in addition to publishing their statements, the inquiry also obtained statements from 4 other individuals, Seema Bala, Sam Smith-Higgins, Margaret Waterton and Fidelma Mallon. And can I invite you, please, to publish both the 4 people that we've heard from and indeed those 4 additional statements onto the inquiry website?
Certainly, and I should say I was rereading the statements of the 4 bereaved that you're about to publish earlier today, and they're all as moving as the evidence we've heard over the last few hours. And also, I should say that you mentioned, I think, in your opening about documents being published. The default setting will be publication unless there's a reason not to.
Thank you very much. We're very grateful. Can I now invite, please, Professor Clive Beggs to be sworn?
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that
the evidence I shall give
the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sit down. Professor, your full name, please.
My name is Clive Baron Beggs.
And you have provided, I think, a 132-page report to Module 3 dealing with the physical science underpinning COVID transmission and its implication for infection, prevention and control in healthcare settings.
Yes, that's the case.
It has the formal INQ ending 474276, and we will be going through a number of pages and paragraphs in it. I hope you have a copy in front of you.
I have, yes.
All right. Before we delve into the science, can I start with you, please, and a little bit about your background? It's set out at pages 4 and 5 of your report, but does it come to this, that you are a bioengineer and a physiologist and an emeritus professor of applied physiology at Leeds Beckett University?
I am, yes.
I think you are a multidisciplinary scientist with more than 25 years researching the transmission of infection in hospitals, and you've worked in neurology as well.
Yes, I have, yes.
Right. You specialise in what is termed interdisciplinary research, and you have particular expertise in the transmission of infectious diseases in hospitals.
Yes.
And you also have particular expertise in ventilation and the behaviour of aerosols in the air, biophysics, and the application of engineering interventions to mitigate the transmission of infection.
Yes, those are all areas of my expertise.
And before entering academia, is it right that you worked as a professional engineer designing ventilation and air conditioning systems for buildings? And as such, you have knowledge, indeed intimate knowledge, of hospital ventilation systems.
Yes, that was the first part of my career.
All right. I think during the COVID pandemic, you worked and served on the Royal Society Rapid Assistance Modelling the Pandemic Working Group.
I did, yes.
And if it's not clear from what I've just said, you are a research scientist, but not a clinician.
That is absolutely the case.
I think, though, that you know that the inquiry has instructed a trio of experts with clinical background who can help in relation to that matter.
Yes.
All right. Can we take down, please, the screen? Thank you very much. And can we, at the outset, please try to ensure that when giving your evidence and people reading your report understand the language and understand the science about the way that the COVID is transmitted? All right.
Yes.
So we're going to look firstly at the language. And I think, Professor, you may have heard me explain that although obviously we're dealing with SARS-CoV-2, for ease, I'm going to try and just refer to it as COVID-19.
Yes, and I will try and use the same, but I probably will slip into SARS-CoV-2. Please forgive me, but and I'll probably say SARS or SARS-CoV-1 for the other one.
For the other one.
Comes up.
All right. If there's any confusion, we will do our best to clarify.
But I will also talk about the spread of COVID as well.
Thank you.
When we're talking about confusion, Professor Beggs, I was having a conversation with a doctor at the weekend, and of course the ventilation gets used in 2 different ways in this context, doesn't it? So you've got the ventilation, which is opening the windows, and you've got ventilating a patient.
Oh, right, yes, yeah, absolutely. In fact, I've had this happen in my professional life when we've been talking to clinicians and there's been crossed wires. Yes, you ventilate patients who are having problems with breathing in intensive care units and places like that. But in this occasion, we're not talking about that. So I have done work on bits and pieces on that, but in this occasion, we're talking about the ventilation of room spaces like this room here. and air movement in rooms.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Some basic terminology, please. And it starts, I think, on page 7 of your report. But I want to just ask you about the language that you have used in the report, because I think you are aware there is not necessarily consensus about the terminology. And we're going to just be clear about what you mean by things, and then we'll look about perhaps at what some other people say about the terminology. All right?
Yes.
Can you help us as a general starting point, though? Why does the terminology matter?
Well, the reason it matters is because historically there's been an awful lot of confusion. And if you think about it, most people involved in infectious diseases are either hospital doctors, microbiologists, virologists, or infection control nurses. They're not necessarily, in fact, they're not trained in engineering generally. And so we've had a kind of two parallel universes come up with one group of people who are on the clinical side of things and mostly in the medical and the infection prevention and control, which I'm going to call IPC after that, who have gone down one route and used one set of terminology, whereas those working in physics, engineering, and aerosol science, I suppose, have used another terminology. And I'm from that camp, although I cross over into them. So I will use, I'm afraid that's the more correct terminology, by the way, from the physics. So I'm going to go with the physics. So that's, there's been a lot of confusion. That's all I'm saying.
We're going to look at perhaps some of the ways that that confusion plays out as we go through your evidence. But can I start with, please, in your report, you use the phrase large droplets. What is a large droplet, please?
Right. First of all, to say droplets, large droplets, I'm using that term here. It's my term for this inquiry because people, especially from a lay background, need to know this. We're talking the upper end of things, and they're above 100 microns. That's micrometers. I'll use the term micrometers or microns, the same thing.
Is that the size of the particle?
That's the diameter of the diameter of the particle, but we abbreviate that to 100 microns. And there's a very good reason that we'll explain in a minute.
Yeah,
I'm sure.
All right. So a larger droplet, in your terminology for this report,
is that, yes.
is a particle greater than 100 microns.
Yes.
All right. And just help the layperson, can we see a micron?
A micron is 1,000th of a millimetre, so we can just about see those 100. It's about the thickness of a hair. I think so. I think I read 50 microns as a thickness of a hair, but it's that type of order of magnitude. Yes, you can actually feel those droplets. You
can feel a larger droplet.
You can feel a larger droplet. When someone coughs on you or something else.
And in a nutshell, help us. How does a larger droplet behave once it's in the air?
Right. So, from an engineering point of view and physics point of view, it behaves ballistically. And that means ballistic means it's got some mass, it's got weight, and when you throw it, so it's like throwing a stone. So it has a trajectory. So it's got some velocity and mass. And if we're talking in the context of respiratory aerosols, someone's exhaled it, either coughed it or whatever, these are so large that they will fall rapidly to the floor, and they can't go more than about a metre and a half before they hit the floor. There's something to do with evaporation, but I'm sure we'll come on to that later.
All right, so the larger droplets behave ballistically, either they go
so ballistically, like a stone being thrown,
right.
That's the way to look at it. They've got a trajectory.
Aerosol particles, please.
Yeah.
How have you defined them in your report?
I've defined them and used the general understanding, which has been around since the 1930s, really, in engineering and physics, with relation to the respiratory particles. They're the particles that are less than 100 microns. Any particle of that size in this context is that. There's not a strict any demarcation for aerosols. It's the definitions to do with the behaviour and the characteristics. I'm sure we'll talk about that in a minute.
You told us how the larger droplets behaved. What about the aerosol particles? How do they behave in air?
Right, so the aerosol particles, just to reiterate, are below 100 microns, right? And they can be of various sizes down to very small sizes. The thing about an aerosol, by definition, an aerosol is a suspension, a mixture of particles, and they can be liquid or solid or a bit of both, which is what you have with respiratory particles, in air, in a gas, in air. And the really key thing is they float, they're suspended, they're floating in the air. And the really important point is that they take on air is a fluid, actually. You don't think of it like that, but it is. It flows. They take on the fluid mechanics, the fluid dynamics of the overall fluid. So, in other words, wherever the air goes, the particles go if they're an aerosol. That's the definition. Right?
So in short, they float.
They float in the air while they're in that air, and therefore you can be interchangeable. Anything that's aerosol transmission is airborne transmission.
Right.
The two are the same.
Pause there. We have a stenographer who is taking a note, and you're also covering some quite complicated.
Yeah.
So I just want to try and break the answers down a little, if I may, and perhaps give slightly shorter answers, and then we can ask for more information if it helps.
Absolutely.
So, larger droplets behave ballistically. They are 100 microns or greater. Aerosol particles are 100, less than 100, and they float in the air, in short.
Yes.
Right, okay. You spoke about the 100 microns being effectively the dividing line between larger droplets and aerosols. Is that a general agreement about that dividing line at 100 microns?
This is where the historical confusion comes in. Amongst physicists and people from my background, physicists and engineers, there's a fairly agreement from back in the 1930s when this work was done. Shall I explain why the division is there at 100?
Yes.
Yeah. The reason that's a division is that as soon as when you exhale particles, right, so I'm just going to call them particles, respiratory particles, both aerosols and droplets, they evaporate. There's a lot of water in them, so they immediately start to evaporate, and they shrink down to about a third of their size. And basically, so if they're less than, say, a 90 micron particle, that will end up at 30. In fact, there's very little in that upper range. They're down at 30 and below. However, the particles that are larger than 100, they're so big that what happens is they don't have a chance to evaporate before they hit the ground. So that's why the divide happens. So this lot are kind of going down onto the floor, whereas the ones smaller, they kind of evaporate, and they then are wafting around the room on the air currents, basically, and they're aerosols.
So I think you said there that where you use the phrase respiratory particles, you're using it as a term that covers both the large droplets and the aerosol particles. Is that right?
Yes, and the reason I'm just to clarify that, when writing this report, I had to, as we will go on to explain, there's a lot of confusion. I had to set out a framework, and so it was extremely helpful just to refer to them as respiratory particles, and that's what I'm doing here, referring to them all as that, including everything.
We are going to come on to look at the way in which viral infections are transmitted, and obviously COVID in particular. But I want to just stand back for a moment and just get an overview of where we were at the start of the pandemic and where we are now in 2024. If I ask you now in 2024, how is COVID transmitted, by which route I mean, what's your answer?
My personal answer and my personal opinion, predominantly by an airborne route.
Right. By an airborne route, by which you mean by aerosol particles? By
aerosol particles, although obviously I'm not excluding other routes as well, and droplets and other things involved, yeah.
So
that's my belief.
Transmits via airborne, but it does also transmit via the droplets.
Oh, yes, and contact.
Right, and then we're going to come on to contact. All right. In a nutshell, what is contact transmission?
That's where we start to talk about hand-to-hand contact. You know, someone coughing into the hand, shaking hands with someone. And then the other contacts are, for example, you cough, you touch a door handle, something we call a fomite. It's an inanimate object. And then someone else touches that and then touches their mouth or their eye or something. There's a route of solid contacts in.
We'll look at that in a bit more detail, but they're the three predominant routes that are in play for the purposes of transmission.
There's some people divide them up into into different names, but
don't worry about that.
Basically, that's what we're talking about: the aerosols, the droplets, and then the contact routes, which include fomite transmission.
So that is, as your opinion of how COVID is transmitted now in 2024. What was your opinion back in 2020 when the pandemic started?
It was airborne.
Fine.
That was my opinion, personally.
And what about those who were advising, preparing papers, preparing IPC guidance? Are you able to tell us what their view was back in 2020 as to how COVID was transmitted?
Not the same as mine. The answer there is, I should have said, sorry, qualified my own belief. I believed it was airborne, but I believed it was likely to be airborne, that there was a strong component. So when I say that, I'm not being exclusive. I'm saying that my belief that it was probably airborne, right? Likely. No, the general belief was that it was by droplets and contact and fomite transmission, that's which we'll come on to.
Right.
That was the general consensus at the beginning of the pandemic, which is why so much emphasis was on washing hands and things like that.
So the position has in fact evolved from droplet being thought of as to be predominant in 2020 to now, certainly by 2024, if not earlier, the role of airborne transmission is now perhaps considered to be different and more important as well.
Yes, the World Health Organization realises now that airborne is, and the CDC, that it makes a significant contribution. There's still arguments over which is the predominant route in various quarters, but it's shifted. The consensus has shifted considerably.
Okay. A little bit more background, please, about how viral or respiratory viral infections transmit. And I think you say at your paragraph 14, as is probably obvious, that in order for an infection to spread, the infectious individual must shed virus particles into the environment in such numbers, thought generally to range from several hundred to many thousands, depending on the virus, such that a few eventually reach the target receptors of a susceptible host. Can we put that into perhaps more easily explicable language?
I can easily do that. It's a numbers game, really. So we've got two ways of looking at this, but the first one is a mechanistic thing. This is what we do as engineers and bioengineers. Things have to get from A to B to cause an infection. So you can look at it in terms of the transmission route or routes. Someone's got to produce some virus that's viable, that's going to transmit through the environment somehow. This could be in the air, or it could be on hands or whatever. Then it's got to get to the target, and the targets in this case are receptors, which I'm sure we'll talk about later on.
Pause there. Just help us in relation to COVID. What are the main receptors?
Oh, the main receptor with COVID is ACE2 receptors.
Right.
No,
and where are they in the body?
Predominantly the ones we're most interested in are in the nasal cavity and also in the upper respiratory tract, in the lining of the mouth, throat. But they do go down into the lungs. They're also on the eyes.
Right.
And I'm not so sure, but I think also possibly on the lips as well, maybe there.
So
but, yeah.
Pausing there, that's in short.
To a lesser extent,
Pausing there, that's in short as to how the virus, COVID, gets into the body, mouth, down the tract, in through the nose or in through the eyes.
There's got to be it doesn't do it by magic. Things have to move from one place to the other, and they have to have some kind of vector, some transport. But on top of that, I think you asked me earlier on if this is okay, or should we leave this for later? The numbers game.
We'll come to the numbers in a minute. I just want to
later.
set out some basics, and then we can descend to the detail as we go through your evidence.
Which, sorry, just to clarify, I think that was in there as well about the hundreds and things like. We'll talk about that later. Yeah.
All right. Can I ask, please, about one of the diagrams in your report? And could we call up, please, page 10 of the report and figure 1, which might help bring this together. I think you've set out there how effectively the virus transmits. You've spoken there about aerosols and droplets, and there's various size of droplets on there. Can you just help us, please? What are we looking at here with the person on the left, the infected person?
This is an excellent diagram, which I use in my own lectures, but is not one I produced. It's from a paper, but it sums it up, everything. So just to, if you can see on the far left-hand side, you can see aerosols and droplets, and that basically tells you everything we've said already, the division. And it highlights that the droplets are not really inhalable and they're larger than 100 microns, whereas the aerosols are inhalable. So if we see the infected person,
Yep.
Now we're actually seeing the whole respiratory tract, their lungs and their upper respiratory tract and everything. That's useful for maybe things we want to say later, but at the moment, that's where the infection occurs.
Right, exactly.
Yep.
Let's just stick with the infected person then. You
Yep.
can see there that we've got their lungs, and indeed you've highlighted, or the figure has highlighted, the alveolar. Is that deep into the lungs, in short?
The alveoli are right at the bottom end, right at the far end of the lungs. That's where the oxygen transfer goes on.
And we go up, effectively, through the bronchial, laryngeal.
Yeah, bronchioles, the larger.
Right, into the person's mouth.
Yeah.
They may be sneezing or coughing here, it matters not. And out come the aerosols and the droplets.
Yeah. We basically call the kind of lower respiratory tract is basically anything below where the kind of mouth and nose is,
Right.
down into the lungs. And the upper respiratory tract is up from the larynx upwards. But so this is where all the droplets come from. There's a lot of fluid there, basically, and all that. And even when people are breathing, they're producing aerosols. So I'm sure we'll talk about that later on, but that's where they come from, originate. And if they're infected, there's a virus in there.
Right.
And that's going to come out. And once they leave the mouth or the nose, they're in the room space and in the environment,
Right.
which is the next part.
Pause there.
Yeah.
We can see then that the infected person has coughed or sneezed or exhaled.
Yeah.
And the size of the droplets. And does the arrow pointing down to the bottom or the middle of the page indicate there effectively the ballistic way?
Yes, that's.
Can I finish?
Yep, sorry, my mistake.
It's all right.
Yeah.
Can we see there the ballistic nature of the droplets falling to the ground?
Yes, we can.
All right. And can we also see there the aerosols, the smaller dots on the screen, floating across to the potential host over a distance of about 1 metre, and then potentially going into the receptors on the potential host?
Broadly speaking, yes, you're right. Of various sizes, those aerosols, they're actually going more than 1 metre in this diagram.
Yes, we can see the scale on the bottom.
They can go a lot further than 1 metre, I can assure you.
Thank you.
And they are then going into the receptors in the susceptible person.
All right.
No.
And help us, please. The aerosols, the smaller particles, where do they tend to end up in the potential host?
What happens is that those aerosols are floating in the air. There are various sizes, right? And they are inhaled. If they come in front of the face, they're inhaled through the nose and through the mouth, depending on whether you're mouth breathing or nose breathing. And what actually happens during respiration is you exhale out, and so when you're exhaling out, there's actually a jet of air coming out, and it's blowing away little aerosols. And then when you go inhale, which we call aspiration, we take a breath through the nose. Actually, the air velocities can be quite large. They can be between 10 centimetres to up to 40 centimetres per second. And these capture the aerosols that are in that area. That's both through the mouth or the nose, depending on the rate of breathing, right? And how wide your mouth is. And those capture them, and the air sucks in, and the aerosols go in, and then they impact in various parts. The smaller ones tend to go deep into the lungs, into the lower respiratory tract, whereas the larger particles, over 10 microns, definitely stick around up here.
All right. So we've just looked there at how the infection gets in to the potential host. I just want to ask you this. Where, in relation to COVID, is it your view that infectious particles are generated in the infected person? And if it helps you, I'm at paragraph 26 in your report on page 13.
Well, I think I can probably answer it anyway, but without looking to it, I think I'm just going to go fly blind. The particle sizes, it used to be thought that it didn't matter where the particles were generated. Now we understand that the particle sizes in the aerosols actually reflect where they're generated in the human body. So the smallest particles are actually generated deep in the lungs, because there's a kind of fluid lining to the lungs and something called a technical thing called a film burst when you breathe out. And that's just even in breathing. And you produce these tiny aerosols. And these are kind of like 1-2 microns size. They're really small. The other place where you get smaller aerosols are often around the vocal cords there as well. They produce small, slightly bigger, but they're also 5 micron, maybe below 10 micron. They can be a range of sizes. So the fluid there. The largest particles are generated in the actual mouth, and they're saliva. That's where the big ones, the over 100 microns. So actually the particle size reflects where they're generated, and now we know also that the microbes, if they're bacteria or viruses, in them tend to reflect where they're generated.
So the question I asked you was, where in relation to COVID were the infectious particles generated?
Good question. The answer is not 100% clear-cut, but I would say mostly in the lungs, deep in the lungs, and in the vocal cords. Although you can't exclude that some of the virus might be in the larger droplets as well.
Understood. Thank you very much.
But in the lungs and the vocal cords, those are key areas, as I'm sure we'll talk about later on, with vocalization. Yeah.
Can you help us with whether it's the droplets or the aerosols that are more likely to contain COVID or not? Which of the two?
It's the aerosols that are more likely at this. There's a reason for this, and it goes back to there's a change in thinking. But we'll talk about that, I'm sure, later on when we talk about other stuff.
Now, how one?
It's in the small droplets. Yeah. That's it. Yeah. There's no small aerosols. Yeah. Small aerosols.
Thank you. All right. So deep in the lungs, small aerosols. That's where the COVID
and vocal cords.
And the vocal cords. All right. Thank you. Help us with how people generate the respiratory particles. Obviously, we've breathing. What about coughing or sneezing?
Yeah, right. So let's go from the kind of least violent, the breathing. So people didn't realise this before, but we are emitting, I'll give you a figure, over 100 small aerosols per second in just breathing. Right. You can't see them, but every one of us is producing that now, right? So they're not insubstantial. So even with just breathing, you produce thousands of these things and hundreds of thousands of them in an hour. The next level up, talking. You're bringing in the vocal cords now, and they vibrate, they produce aerosols. Off the top of my head, I can't remember the numbers.
Don't worry.
But it's an appreciable increase. But the louder you talk, shouting, more gets produced. So if you're in a loud, noisy situation, you raise your voice, more aerosols. Singing, particularly, lots of aerosols. They're nearly up to, I think it sticks in my head, of about 900 aerosols per second. Then we go to the things that the kind of symptomatic things, coughing and sneezing. Now, they're slightly different in the sense that when you have a cough, and especially a sneeze, you get a violent action, and that brings in the whole of the system, and that strips out more aerosols. So you get a wider range, you get larger droplets produced in those things, and a lot of particles in between. That's how it works.
All right. Can I just touch on evaporation, because you told us about the respiratory particles being made up of water, which clearly evaporates. And if it helps you, Professor, I'm around paragraph 30 on page 15 of your report. But I think you say this, that no matter what the size, all respiratory particles comprise mainly of water because they're formed in the lungs, throat and mouth. And as soon as the particles exit the mouth or nose and enter drier air, they immediately start to lose water due to evaporation and dramatically shrink in size to about 1/3 of their original diameter. Now, help us with the droplet and the aerosols and how they evaporate.
Right. I've done plenty of modelling of this over the years in my own work. You've got to understand that a small particle has a small mass for a very large surface area. Think of it as small, we're talking balls, and like from, football, the large one, going down to kind of like, marble size or whatever. So the relationship, as you get smaller, the surface area is much greater to the mass. So you evaporate through the surface area. So these poor small aerosols, small particles, they're losing them even faster. So they're going right down. They've got moisture in there. They've also got proteins and other solids in there. So they evaporate down into these things, right? Whereas the larger droplets, they've got a small surface area in comparison to their mass. So the evaporation is less with the larger droplets, hence why they struggle to evaporate before they hit the ground. But generally speaking, the kind of rule of thumb, and that's why to make sense of this, around about a third of their size. That's a good rule of thumb.
So can I just see if I understood this correctly? Is it the case that the aerosols evaporate quickly?
Rapidly, yes.
Right.
But
the larger particles don't evaporate before they hit the floor?
Yeah, simple. That's the general overall thing.
Right.
And the ones that evaporate go to about a third of their size.
Right, understood. But the smaller particles, the ones less than 100 microns, presumably they can become still suspended in the air and float around.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, just to clarify one point, just to give an illustration.
Please do.
If you produce an aerosol, so say you had it doesn't mean that you're 100. It's a whole gradation of things coming out of the mouth. You can have something at 10, something at 20. So if you had a 15 micron particle, that is so small in comparison to its large surface area. It's going to be evaporated down within, a few centimetres from the mouth. It's done its evaporation, and it's a small particle moving around, so it's very rapid.
I think you said in your report at page 16, paragraph 37, that there was historically, many people concluded wrongly, that the vast majority of exhaled viruses would be contained in the larger droplets, which were assumed to travel no further than about 1.5 metres. But over the years, that assumption has been shown to be incorrect.
The answer is yes. Shall I elucidate on
Yeah,
that?
what I want to try and understand is why that's important for us to be aware of that historical misunderstanding, if that be the right phrase, and how it affects COVID and the transmission of COVID.
It's absolutely fundamental.
All right.
Because it's a bit like a house of cards. Once that goes, everything else goes. So it's crucial. That's a crucial and important factor. Can I just elucidate on it?
Please do.
Right. So, it's a perfectly logical position to hold this, by the way. And I used to believe it myself, right? And that was my understanding. So it's reasonable to appreciate this. So when you look at all those droplets and aerosols, all the respiratory particles that come out of the mouth during, let's say, a cough, for example, right? An exhalation event, a cough. So if you added them all together, you would have a bulk of fluid, right? And we know that the virus is in that fluid, right? But actually, if we looked at the quantity of the fluid, if you think about it, the actual volume of the fluid, most of that fluid, kind of 90% of it, is actually in particles that are over 10 microns in diameter. The bulk of the fluid is in the big droplets, right? Which you think, well, what's the point of that? Until you go to the next stage. So where's the virus likely to be? And we thought that the fluid was all the same. And we didn't understand completely that the virus reflected where the sites where they were generated. We thought that it was just evenly distributed through the whole of the fluid. So that meant if most of the fluid was in the large droplets, then most of the virus must be in the large droplets. And so historically, those involved in infection prevention and control and public health, and you will see it as we'll talk in other documents, made the assumption, and many scientific papers made the assumption, that the bulk of the virus was in those large droplets that don't travel very far. Mm-hmm. Now, that is not the case. Right. But that's only been discovered in the last 10 years or so, 10, 12 years, right, as the science improved. But we will, I'm sure, talk about that.
All right. Now, my lady, can I interpose at this point to say this? Professor Beggs has very helpfully, in his report, set out key findings which summarise a number of paragraphs and pages. If anyone is either struggling to follow or wants to kind of have a quick, easy reference guide, the key finding boxes are very helpful in drawing all of this together. So can I just put that advert out there, if I may, in an attempt, I hope, to help anyone who's following online in particular. Now, can I just ask you this, please, Professor? Is there any scenario or situation in which someone could produce a droplet without also generating significant amounts of aerosols?
No.
No. All right. And when we think about COVID, can I ask you, please, about what you've termed virus shedding? And I'm at paragraph 38 in your report on page 17. Just in layman's terms, what's virus shedding?
Right. So in the context of that diagram we've just seen there, yes. So if it's not clear, the latest science is that the bulk of the virus is in the smaller aerosols, right, the under 5 microns. I'm sure we'll mention that later, but that's the case. The bulk of the virus is in the smaller aerosols, not in the big droplets. That's the evidence now. That goes for both influenza and COVID.
All right.
Right. So now, virologists talk about virus shedding. What they're meaning is, this is getting back to the numbers game, it's the quantity of virus that's shed by any route. So this could be, for example, it comes out of somewhere out of the mouth or the nose, but they don't just mean in the aerosols. They mean you can cough in your hands and then touch something. The virus can be wherever it is. So when they talk about virus shedding, they're talking about the number of, rather confusingly, virus particles, which are even smaller, viruses. And these viruses, they look to see, they do it by various means, but anyway, virus shedding is basically just the number of viruses that are just kind of released by an infectious person by whatever means.
Now, in relation to COVID, obviously there may be a period of time where you are infectious, but you don't know that you are. All right?
Absolutely.
Asymptomatic, as it's sometimes called. There's also the pre-symptomatic period. Help us with those and what you say at paragraph 38, please, in your report.
Absolutely. You've led me nicely to the right point there. Right, so when you come into contact with someone who is infectious, so they may not appear infectious, they may not be coughing. That's what, they may be perfectly all right. They don't realise they're infectious. And that's what we call asymptomatic. They don't show any symptoms, right? But they're still infectious. However, when you meet them, you don't know whether they've not shown any symptoms, but in 2 or 3 days' time, they may get very, very ill and feel really unwell and stay at home. Actually, they're asymptomatic at that time, but they go on to develop symptoms. So we say they are pre-symptomatic. So strictly speaking, asymptomatic refers to people who never show any symptoms, but it's a kind of loose thing. It overlaps with pre-symptomatic. It's a working term for, it can include pre-symptomatic people. I would use it in that way. So in other words, I would say it is people who appear to have no symptoms and are still infectious.
Right. So that period of time when you don't know you've got it, in short, because you feel all right.
Yeah.
Help us there, please. I think that's when you say in your report that that's when the individual is most contagious.
Yeah, the most contagious period is shortly before they become symptomatic, if they do become symptomatic, and for that 2 to 3 days beforehand, and shortly afterwards, I think is also fair to say, it then starts to subside the infectivity after their symptoms develop. Is that make all right?
Yes, it does, thank you. So it's a dangerous situation where people are walking around feeling well, but could in fact be transmitting the virus.
Yes.
Right. And I think you said in your report that the virus was able to spread for maybe 2 to 3 days before any symptoms develop. But with COVID, there were variations between the various strains in how long people were incubating the virus for.
Yeah, I think right. So in that paragraph there, I use the term incubation. So incubation is not quite the same as shedding. Incubations from the minute you first get infected. At that point, you're not shedding that much virus because you're not that infected. You are infected, but it hasn't had a chance to replicate in your body. But as it starts to replicate, then you become infectious. So I think the original figure that I've got down here, the figure that sticks in my head is 4 to 7 days. I think that's for the original strain, the Wuhan strain of the.
You've got 4.6 to 6.4 days. 4 to
7 days. That sticks there. But for the subsequent waves, the Delta, the Omicron, they found the incubation periods were shorter, so it came on quicker. Presumably, then also that would mean that a similar type of period of asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic infection. But I'm not an expert on that, so I'm going to say that I'm on dodgy ground there. But you certainly will have exactly the same. You'll have a pre-symptomatic period where you're not showing symptoms and you're still shedding.
So whatever time you're incubating the virus for, there is a period of time potentially where you are contagious and you don't know you're ill, and therefore may not be wearing a mask, may not be hand washing, may be in close contact with people, all of the ways in which the virus could easily spread.
Yes, and you may be singing, which is, not a good situation.
Right. Can I just deal with few more questions, please, about asymptomatic transmission, and then perhaps we'll take a break if we may, my lady. Thank you. And if it helps you, Professor, can I turn you, please, to page 22 of your report? And your key findings box at the top of that page, maybe the easy way into this. Thank you very much. Maybe the easy way into this few questions. I think you set out there that a third to half of all COVID-19 cases are asymptomatic.
Yeah, my understanding, in fact, it varies by age group. So in children, it's even higher than that, and young people. But in older people and elderly people, it's much less than that. So it kind of balances out about 30 to 40% is the kind of figures that I see are asymptomatic. Yeah, I think that's reasonable to say.
And then you go on to say there that although asymptomatic transmission of SARS or COVID is a widespread phenomenon, early in the pandemic it was not known to what extent it occurred. SAGE regularly reported on the gradually strengthening evidence base, and by September 2020 confirmed definitively that it was occurring.
Yeah, it's a really tricky one, this, in the sense that, what do we mean by asymptomatic transmission? Is this people who are asymptomatic all the way through or pre-symptomatic? And that was a blurring line, so it makes it very difficult. But they were aware early, in the SAGE minutes that I've seen, they were discussing it and they were aware that this was a potential problem, but they didn't know the extent to it. And there's a BMJ article, I think, in December of that year, that is saying we still don't know the magnitude of it. But certainly by the minutes of the meeting in September, this was becoming, it was firming up.
Now, I think it's important to point out, isn't it, that asymptomatic infection does not necessarily lead to asymptomatic transmission. Is that correct?
Yes, except for, of course, we've got the problem of pre-symptomatic is asymptomatic at the time, so it's how you define it. So it doesn't always. There is some evidence that some people who never develop symptoms have a lower viral load, so they're less infectious. But of course, that person who you meet at work or whatever, or who doesn't show any symptoms but has COVID, you don't know whether they're pre-symptomatic or asymptomatic. So it's a very blurry boundary. That's what I'm saying.
And finally, there are those key findings. Asymptomatic transmission of COVID accounts for many of the infections acquired in hospitals, and we'll probably hear more of that, my lady, with the IPC trio next week.
I was going to mention that because not being a clinician, and I read the papers and I'm aware of this. I was asked to comment on it, but the clear evidence from what others have reported is that asymptomatic transmission, both amongst healthcare workers and patients, made a major contribution to transmission in hospitals and other healthcare.
And just the final bullet point there before we take our break. You referenced there that there is some evidence that flu can also be transmitted by asymptomatic people who are infectious. Why have you made reference there to flu when predominantly we're talking about COVID?
Right, well, throughout this, I was given a brief to look at transmission of infection, and you can't, if you're looking at pandemic preparedness, it was all around influenza. Influenza, and I would also put RSV, another respiratory infection. The mechanisms of transmission were all very similar. The viral agent's different, so it makes sense to look at them. So I have looked also at influenza. I was asked to look at influenza, and as I was doing that, I was asked by the inquiry to look at the asymptomatic transmission of influenza, which I have to confess that I'd never looked at. And so I dug down into the information. So I don't claim to be an expert on asymptomatic transmission of influenza, but I looked into the evidence base. And it was interesting because there was some contrasting views, but the overall consensus was that yes, it does occur, but not to the extent as with COVID. Right? So that's why I looked at it.
Is that the point there perhaps being made that if the planning was based about flu and flu could transmit asymptomatically, those that were looking at COVID and drawing parallels with the flu planning might therefore have thought more quickly, well, asymptomatic transmission could also be a route in relation to COVID?
That is a very, very obvious and logical and reasonable stance to take. I think, you know, when I looked at the evidence for asymptomatic transmission of influenza, I very quickly dug up papers that were showing quite large, similar types of levels to COVID. And then, as I looked at them, I suddenly realised there was a large controversy about this, and that some people were criticising the methodology. And when you actually looked at the methodologies and trying to decide what was pre-symptomatic and what's asymptomatic, that's the big problem. It came down to, I figure, I'm sorry, off the top of my head, I can't say, it's in the report, but 15% sticks in my head. But I don't know whether that is the case, right? So without reading it.
When do you say, you said a consensus developed that flu can be asymptomatic? When did that consensus develop, it having been controversial?
Let's just...
very roughly.
It's down in my... I've got it written.
Is it before the pandemic or not?
Oh, yes, before the pandemic.
Okay.
There, I think it is, anyway.
Well, don't worry, that's...
Sorry, I'm searching through my text here.
May I make a suggestion?
Yeah, we can take the break and
Yeah.
you can confirm after the break.
Yes, I can certainly do that, yeah.
Right, we'll take 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, my lady.
Ms. Carey.
Thank you. Before we had our break, I think, Professor, you were just answering some questions, indeed one from her ladyship, about the evidence that flu can be transmitted by asymptomatic, and we left it on a cliffhanger that you were going to go and look it up. So can we turn, please, to paragraph 53 in your report? Right, well,
I said 15%, it was 16%, so I wasn't far off.
I'll let you off.
But I think the first point there is it's not clear-cut by any means. Difficulties are because, frankly, how do you know who's truly asymptomatic and how much is pre-symptomatic? But you can see the dates here. Right at the top, the first sentence, it says most cases of seasonal influenza are thought to be asymptomatic, and that was someone, Hayward, in 2014. However, that's disputed by various people and various things and methodologies and everything. And this comprehensive, so we're down at about line 5 or 6, a comprehensive meta-analysis in 2015 said really that's 16%, and that's Luang in 2015. Right. You know? So it was definitely there. But the key point at the bottom, just to get it over, is, of course, those people, if they're lower infectious and fewer symptoms, they mix more. So whether they were transmitting more depends on not only how ill they were, but also how much they mixed, should we say. Sorry, I've added that on. But
no, don't worry, because I think what I wanted just to try and be clear, and I know this will resonate, my lady, with evidence you've heard, I suspect, in modules 1 and 2. I think there was a pre-pandemic flu strategy in 2011. And we're going to perhaps look at that a little later with Professor Beggs. So there's the underpinning document in 2011, and then these various studies in 2014, 2017, 2015, etc., albeit not consensus on that either, that suggested, though, that flu was thought to be asymptomatic. So we'll just keep that chronology, if we may, in our minds as we go through.
Can I just clarify?
Yes.
What I'm saying here, it was known that some influenza transmission was asymptomatic before the pandemic.
Yeah.
And the dispute was on how many?
How many?
Yeah.
And it was
Okay.
to do a
So I
methodology.
can confidently say it was known that some cases are asymptomatic.
All I've reported is what
Thank you.
was in the papers, and that's what was said.
Thank you.
The references are all there.
Thank you very much, Professor. New topic, if I may, please. And in your report, if it helps you, we're at page 24. And I'd like to examine with you, please, the movement of infectious particles through the air. Now, we've probably touched on it a little bit by looking at the ballistic way that the droplets behave in contrast to the way that the aerosols float through the air. My paraphrasing, I appreciate. But there we have, I hope at the top, a little summary of that. The exhaled respiratory droplets greater than 100 microns behave ballistically, fall to the floor. The smaller particles shrink due to evaporation, as we've looked at, and become even smaller aerosol particles which can float in the air. Now, help us, please. You say these small aerosol particles can take many minutes, even hours, to settle out of the air, and therefore can be transported long distances around the rooms by air currents.
Can I direct you? Can we put it up? Direct you to table 1 in paragraph 59.
Yes, I'm going to come on to that, but if it helps you to answer the questions, please do, because what I really wanted to know was, how long does it take? How far can they go?
That's what I was going to do.
All right.
That's why, and the table would be, that's it, thank you. Right. Back in 1851, a guy called Stokes developed a whole load of laws to do with, basically it was understood how aerosols behave, right, and how particles in air behave. And we use them in engineering to predict how aerosols behave. And basically Stokes's law can be applied both to moving particles but also to particles in still air. And here what we have here is a table for various sizes, and I just did it for illustrative purposes, a range of sizes. And I'm assuming 2 meters, which is the height of a tall person producing, but it's an approximate height. And you can see there that, say we take a 5 micron particle, that actually takes, descends at about, it takes 32 minutes to fall to the floor.
Right. So if someone were 2 meters tall,
yeah, it's a bit higher for the height of a thing.
Yeah.
32 minutes, right? So we can set the clock and we can wait till past and it's still falling. And that's in an absolutely still room. This room and every other room that you'll be in has movement, because basically if we have a mechanical ventilation system, we've got lots of movements in here, but when people walk around, and we're each producing what's called a thermal plume, because we're warm, and we have a convective current. So there's lots of air movement. So they will stay airborne for a lot longer than this.
Can I just interrupt to say the transcriber's software has crashed, but they'll catch up on the transcriber.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So you mentioned there the thermal plume. Help us. Where is it? What is it? How does it work?
All right, yeah, it's been overlooked a lot. Thermal plume, basically your skin is at about, 36, 37 degrees. The air's at 20 degrees. When it comes into contact with you, you're warm, and you've got, every one of us here has got a rising current of air, convective current of air, passes over the face, around the back of the head, and you've got a big plume, and we can actually visualise this.
Pause there, because there may be a diagram that helps you. Could I call up, please, figure 7 on page 26 of the report? Because I think this will demonstrate what you're... So there's a person at the bottom.
Yeah, this is my colleague at Queen Mary's in London.
And the halo, for want of a better phrase, is that the thermal plume?
It is, yeah.
Describing?
What we did there, this is something called Schlieren photography, which is a very specialist type of photography, which is useful in this situation. The horizontal line, by the way, in this particular, is us trying to simulate a ceiling. Right?
Okay.
So what actually happens, and we've got a video of this online, you can see that we have this constant flow of streams of air going up. They get to the ceiling and then they spill out across the ceiling. depending on the height of the ceiling, of course. And you can see it really is quite, they can be kind of moving at the highest above the head at about 30 centimetres, a foot a second. And that can transport quite large aerosols up. What we think is happening, anything that gets entrained into that goes up to the ceiling, then fans out, and then after a while it gets slowed down and the heavy particles fall out. But it can also go for radiators. In rooms, they can do the same thing. It's an area that's not it's the big difference between indoor transmission and outdoor transmission. It's one of the key differences. Right. Outdoors, it just goes up and is distributed.
Right. So the virus can go up in the particles, up through upwards through the thermal plume, and then into presumably any current of air that is within the room.
Well, in fact, here we've got what we call four-ways louver diffusers. They're something called a Coanda effect. They're shooting air underneath the ceiling. So if someone's producing a thermal plume that then mixes with that and there's particles in it, they will be distributed around. So this idea, it's very complex. It's complex fluid mechanics, and it's different in every space. But this idea that we can just say a particle falls out of the air very quickly, by its size, it depends what it comes into contact with. And this is the problem.
Can I see if I understand this correctly? Your thermal plume sitting there will travel upwards, and on a current, could there flow in the direction of Her Ladyship, me, everyone else?
It could do.
Right.
Obviously, the smaller particle, the heavier the particle, the point about the aerosol is that it will only, the particles will only stay suspended in the air until the air current drops in its strength, at which point they start to descend, but they then fall into the next air. They kind of do that, but they go a lot further. So the table in table 1 is an ideal situation in still air.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I've seen in lots of literature people saying the worst case is they say like a 5-micron particle can't go more than a metre, which is just wrong. But people sometimes take a value off here, but rooms are not still. Yeah. That's the whole point. That's the bit that I'm trying to get over.
Are you able to help us with how far, in metres or whatever metric you wish to use, an aerosol can travel? In a room like this, perhaps, might be the easy way of thinking about it.
Yeah, they can travel a long way, much further than 2 metres, right? That's from the social distancing point of view, and where we'll talk about near field and far field. If we could look at figure 8, please.
I thought you were going to turn to that. Yeah, my lady's behind tab 8, and it is INQ 497038. This is going to be, when we get it on screen, there we are.
Oh, right, that's, I didn't think that was figure 8, actually, but it doesn't matter, this is good as well.
Just deal with this. Well, this one is in the context of 6-bed
very
bay.
Good. Figure 8 in the report was actually also computational fluid dynamics. CFD stands for computational fluid dynamics, and it's a tool that we use, physicists and engineers use, to simulate complex flows of air and particles and fluids in various environments. And this is actually work that we had done at Addenbrooke's. I worked with Addenbrooke's team there at Addenbrooke's Hospital, and this simulator is one of the wards there, where you have a classic 6-bedded bay. And what happens is we used a team of aerodynamicists used computational fluid dynamics to simulate the transmission of aerosol particles. And there we have a bed, the dark bed on the right-hand side in the middle of the 6-bedded bay is a patient who's infectious. We can't see the thermal plume here. They're lying in bed, they're exhaling out. And this is actually 2.5 micron particles. And we built in the thermal plume. And what you see is the density of the particles after 10 minutes in that space of regular breathing out and exhaling particles. And you can see them migrating all the way through. And in fact, as part of the studies that we did at Addenbrooke's, we looked at the particles, and we could see them migrating throughout the whole ward within minutes. Yeah, it takes time. That's what I'm trying to say. They can transmit 10 meters easily. You know?
And so, although this is a simulation of a 6-bedded bay, one can see there that not only is there the infection concentrated around the infectious patient, but the 2 beds either side of the infectious patient, and indeed the aerosol beginning to spread out to the other 3 patients and up to the top of the
into
bay.
the corridor. That's the corridor towards the nurse's station. Sorry, you said a simulation there. This is a simulation.
Yes.
But in fact, just to clarify that, and that we also did measurements. We had particle counters throughout the whole ward. Now, these are not looking at bioaerosols, they're just looking at particulates. Throughout the whole ward, and in an earlier study, we actually measured the transport, and we published this in the Journal of Hospital Infection. And what we found was, for example, when the ward round came round, we saw the particles go up in one part of the ward, 10, 15 metres away at the far end, and then those particles just migrated all the way through, as with the ward round as the doctors went round, but also as the air currents moved, which is exactly what we're seeing here.
Thank you.
So it's not just simulation.
No, understood. Perhaps we just take that diagram down, please, because it brings me on to inhalation and the risk of inhalation. And if it helps you, Professor, I'm at paragraph 65 onwards in your report, which is at page 28.
Yeah.
I'll just give you a moment to turn that up. It's probably evident, just looking at the key findings first of all, that when aerosols are inhaled, the different sized particles land in different places within the respiratory system. All right? And the smallest particles, which, as you told us before the break, are more likely to contain the virus, they tend to travel deep into the lungs, while the larger aerosol particles land in the mouth and throat.
Yes. But, yeah.
Did you want to add a caveat to that?
Yeah. There's no clear cut-off, right? So historically, the kind of, which comes back from almost the end of the Spanish flu in the First World War, the early part of the 20th century. So it's pretty old science. But it was realised then that particles that were less than 5 microns tended to travel into the lower respiratory tract. What that means is that they went deep into the lungs. Particles above that size that were inhaled tended to stick in the nasal cavity in the upper respiratory tract. And clinicians used that as a demarcation to do with TB. TB went down in the lungs. They thought that was small microns, whereas things like influenza, which predominantly infects the upper respiratory tract, first and foremost, they thought, well, that must be in particles bigger than 5 microns. And we'll come on to that later. But the truth of the matter is it's a gradation. It's roughly around there, but it's kind of 10 to 5 microns. 10 microns can go deeper into the lungs as well, and some 5 microns can stay up in the upper respiratory tract. But the important point there is that particles in inhalation up to 100 microns can be inhaled if the air is strong enough if they're in the region. They can, but they don't go deep. They just stay up here.
Right.
But most of the particles that are being inhaled and tend to end up somewhere in the system are under 20 microns. That's the general rule. But it's not hard and fast.
No, understood. All right. Now, I think you said, though, in your report at paragraph 66, that aerosol particles tend to be light and slow-moving, and as such are easily inhaled.
Yes.
If a susceptible person is close to the infectious person, then there is the potential for the droplets via the eyes or the mucous membranes in the mouth and nose. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yes. I'm just trying to see this. Yeah. So This is about droplet transmission, the larger droplets,
is.
right? So, yeah. So we're talking about larger than 100 microns. They can't travel very far. So if someone's in close proximity to someone else, within a metre, say, and someone coughs or sneezes and they're infectious, they're going to produce a whole load of aerosols and droplets. But those droplets have got a trajectory and they're ballistic, and they can land, we all know it, we've all experienced it when someone's coughed or spoken, and you can feel the spit, on your forehead. That's a very large droplet. But they could land on your eye, and there's some ACE2 receptors there, or sialate receptors with influenza, and that could cause an infection, a route of what we call a portal of entry. Or, and it's a bit more ambiguous on this one, it could land on your lips, for example. It could land on that's trickier. In my opinion, it's trickier, but traditionally it's thought on the nose.
Pausing there, if we just think about
That's the droplet,
understood.
not the aerosol.
I know. If we just pause there and I think about it in the context of a nurse taking a vital sign, blood pressure or temperature in the ear, essentially what you're saying there is that the droplet, the larger particle, can easily, if they're up close to them, end up in the eye or in the mouth, albeit that you're less...
Absolutely. Yeah, well, I personally find it harder to see how it gets up the nose, because what's happening is these droplets are tending to fall away, and they're large, so they can't really be inhaled very easily. So they're moving away, they've got momentum, so they're not being drawn in, but certainly on the eyes. But they could land on the lips.
So if the nurse...
Maybe on the nose, and someone could touch them and then pass it on, rub their eye or something.
So if the nurse is not wearing a goggle or a visor, that's an easy route.
That's an easy route for that. I've got to say, it's a route, but the epidemiology supporting this is not actually that strong, because when I looked at it, this is what is supposed to happen. And it's plausible, definitely.
Now, let's look at the aerosol particles and your paragraph 67, and you say that because they are suspended in the air, the quantity that will be inhaled is directly proportional to the concentration of the particles in the air and the volume of the air that is inhaled. So take a slightly different example now. The nurse is not taking blood pressure or the temperature, but is on the other side of the room dealing with another patient. Help us, please, with what you say there and the level of risk to the nurse.
Yes, I will, but I want to just say one thing in relation, because it's important to do this. So let's make the nurse, again, taking blood pressure in the same position as the droplet. You can't have droplets without aerosols. So if that nurse has got no mask on, for example, they may receive a droplet in the eye. It's a fairly small target, but they're more likely to get a face full of aerosols and inhale those into their things. In my opinion, that's a higher likelihood. So in that near field, they can get that. But of course, aerosols don't just stop there. They pass on further. So now we go to the longer range thing that you've just described. So,
well, we're going to look at near field and far field. So it may be as well to deal with it now.
Right. So going back to the concentration of the particles, it's irrespective from the aerosol point of view of whether it's in the near field or the far field, near or further away. You breathe in some air which has some virus in it, viral particles. So it's actually just the number of viral particles the risk is related to this is the numbers game. The more viral particles you inhale, the more likelihood that one's going to hit one of those receptors and cause the infection. So it's to do with the volume of air inhaled, wherever you are in the room, and the concentration of particles in that. And obviously, if you're close up, the concentration is likely to be greater than if you're further away. And the volume of air inhaled, that's the total volume, depends on how fast you're breathing, how much you take in, but also how long you are. So we now have... As
in how long you are exposed.
Exposed.
Right. Can we
we'll
hive that off, if we may, and deal with that slightly
So
separately?
the volume and the concentration changes where you are in the space. But it's dependent also on how much air you breathe in, and that's dependent on time.
So can I see if I
Professor,
understand?
can I just interrupt? I know how careful you're trying to be and and it really is very helpful information. But Miss Carey's an expert at getting what she needs and what I'm going to need. So if you could just try and shorten your answers, and if she wants more, she'll ask for more.
I will, yes, certainly.
Because we have limited time. I'm sorry to have to...
No, that's okay. It's very understandable.
No, so thank you, my lady. Can I ask you, see if I understand this correctly from your report? If the susceptible individual spends 2 hours in the room as an infectious person, they're going to be at much greater risk of acquiring the infection compared with someone who's only in there for 5 minutes?
Yes.
All else being equal?
All else being equal, yes.
But of course, one's got to bear in mind then how close you are to the infectious person.
Yes. So you... All right.
Go on, no, you can carry on.
So we could have, for example, someone who is close to a person for a short period of time, inhaling a certain infectious dose. They've got a high concentration, but they take it in for a short time. Or in a cafe, for example, or someone on the other side of the cafe is working there for 4 hours, or with their computer, and they're breathing in infectious air. They're breathing in a smaller concentration, but for longer, and so they can actually get the same infectious dose, actually a greater infectious dose, even though the concentration is lower in the far field.
So for the infection to occur, is this right? You need to have inhaled a respiratory aerosol that contains the virus.
Yes.
The aerosol must come into contact with a receptor, nose, mouth.
Wherever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The virus in the aerosol must be fit enough to bind onto the receptor.
Yeah, it's got to be viable to get in,
Yep.
and there's got to be enough of it to get into it, basically, yeah.
And then once inside the receptor or the cell, the virus must overcome any of our own immune system in order for the infection to take hold.
Yes, so what actually happens is that most virus particles either miss receptors or get knocked out by the host defences, or not fit enough, and it's just that few that get through.
Right.
It's a numbers game.
So does that generally mean, therefore, that a large number of virus particles need to be inhaled in order for an infection to be established?
The figure that sticks in my head from I think it's the Skagit Choir analysis, or is it, that's another paper, is 600, I think, in this particular case, for a kind of ratio of 600 to 1,
Right.
the expected dose to be inhaled. But that again is an estimate that's in.
But in short, you've got to get a large number.
You've got to get a large number, but that is
all.
always the case with viruses, you know.
All right. And if I understand your evidence correctly, therefore exposure time and concentration of the virus in the air are critical when we're looking at how the infection gets in and spreads.
Absolutely, yes. The longer you spend in a space,
Yeah.
even if the concentration is not that high, you're at risk.
Can I ask you about an example that you refer to in your report, please, at paragraph 74
Yep.
on page 30 of your report, which might highlight the importance of exposure time and indeed concentration of the virus in the air.
Which was it? Yeah.
It's,
Yes, I've got it, yeah.
yes. I think you looked there in situations where the viral load is allowed to accumulate in the
Yeah.
air, let's say in a poorly ventilated room.
Yes, right.
Even short exposure times can result in significant risk.
Yeah.
Especially, let me just finish, and then this is especially in the case where individuals may be shouting, singing, or just talking, and then you go on to refer to a study by Alsved.
Yeah.
Help us with this paragraph, please.
Yes, no problem. Right, so two things happen, really. When you exhale a virus, exhale aerosols which contain virus. So you imagine someone in the near field, they're going to get a waft of this thing through past them. It goes
Pausing there, near field 1 to 2 metres, roughly?
1 to 2 metres, yeah. I call it, yeah, that kind of region. They'll get the first waft, which is a high concentration, and that could occur indoors or outdoors, right? But those aerosols then, assuming they're not inhaled, progress into the room and mix, and then the air currents in the room take them around. And this is where it differs from indoors and outdoors. So outdoors, there's a progressive dilution. But what happens indoors is, because we've got an enclosed space, these aerosols start to waft around and build up in concentration in the space. So someone in the far field who's some distance from the infected person, they can be breathing a kind of soup of aerosols, if the virus is in there, if it's a poorly ventilated space, of a fairly high concentration over quite a long period of time. And it's made even worse if you're in an environment like the Skagit Choir, which we may come on to later, where people were singing, if it's noisy, a nightclub or a church or something, where lots of super spreading events have occurred, where we have generally got people raising their voices. Singing is a classic one.
Yeah.
And so they're producing lots of aerosols into the space, and the concentration builds up and everyone's breathing it in. And in that situation, Alsford calculated quite a short period of time, even within 37 minutes. It depended on the ventilation rate and all the rest of it.
So is it fair to say that healthcare workers treating patients who are generally in the near field, in that 1 to 2 metre range, or potentially right up close to them, are more generally exposed to the near field risk?
In that specific situation, yes and no. They're in the near field risk when they're treating that patient and caring for that patient. They're in the far field risk when they're at the nurse's station, or it's a cleaner or someone who's working around about. And other patients may be in the near and the far field, depending on the situation.
It's not just nurses, non-clinical staff like the cleaners, the porters, someone.
Non-clinical staff are also exposed to it in offices and hospitals and things like that as well.
And I think you said in your report, I won't take you to it, Professor, but you said that when considering the near field, direction is important. Clearly, face-to-face poses more of a risk.
Yeah.
Side to side, a risk, but not as much as face-to-face.
Near field, definitely, if you're in front of that, what we call the exhalation plume, you're going to get a higher dose. Actually, there is a slight caveat to that in the clinical scenario, because patients are often in bed, and so the thermal plume rises up from them, as their exhalation does as well. And so clinical staff are often above the patient. So I would include both the exhalation plume and the thermal plume. So if you've got a patient, you're taking blood pressure or something, they're lying down, you can be leaning over them and getting both the exhalation and the thermal plume. So,
right,
yeah.
Understood. There's a number of variables there as to how you end up getting infected, but can I look at a different form of transmission now briefly and come on to what you've termed fomite and contact transmission? And it's at page 36 in your report, Professor. And again, terminology may be important here. And so actually, thank you. The key findings may be a helpful way in to this evidence. I think you said in your report that historically flu and other respiratory viruses have been assumed to be transmitted by droplet transmission, the larger particles, and by contact.
Yes.
All right.
And fomite as a subgroup.
Yes. There's direct contact, indirect contact, and there's also the phrase fomite. So let's deal with those, if we may, please. Can I just deal with contact? Direct contacts. Help us, please. What is meant by the phrase direct contact? And if it helps you, it's paragraph 91 on page 37.
Yeah, right. So I'm not actually saying contact. I'm talking about direct routes and indirect routes there. And it's important in the thing. So shall I explain?
Yes, please do.
I was asked by the inquiry to examine all the routes, right? And I have done quite a bit on hand washing and in my time, but mostly in things like MRSA. So I wanted to set it alongside the airborne and the droplet as well. So we're looking at the whole picture, because it's really important that the number of intermediary steps, the virus can get diluted, basically, right? So I wanted to talk about direct routes. In this report, it's confusing because they talk about direct contact and indirect contact. So I'm talking about direct routes in this report and in this paragraph as meaning there's no intermediary stage. So that could be a droplet going from coughing and landing on someone's eye, or it could be an aerosol going out, flowing round and going up someone's nose.
Right. So
that's direct. There's
Pause.
Yep.
Thank you. I just want to make sure I understand that right. The virus travels from the infected person to the receptor without touching anything in between.
Yeah. So whatever is in the virus that left the mouth, and we're talking in those situations, certainly in the near field, within seconds in the case of the droplet, within minutes. So there's nothing in the way to interfere.
Understood. Indirect may be obvious now, but help us please. Looking at paragraph 91, I think you said that indirect routes involve one or more intermediary steps.
Yes.
So in the context of respiratory transmission, help us with that, please.
Well, it's difficult. I suppose that could be with the intermediary step there. Is the droplet when it lands on the outside of the nose and someone touches it and then rubs their eye. That would be an intermediary step.
Or a droplet falls onto a bed handle, on a patient's bed.
Classic. There's a bed rail or it drops onto a surface, a patient's surface, so the patient does that, or onto a medical instrument or something.
Understood.
The nurse touches it and then rubs their eye, for example, or whatever.
So there's contamination effectively via some kind of intermediary surface.
An intermediary step,
right.
and the classic one is the handshake is that.
Well, I wanted to ask you about that because handshaking is sometimes given as an example of direct. But if I understand you correctly, it isn't, because it's got to go onto my hand. I shake the other person's hand, and they then have to transmit it to a receptor. Is that right?
Yes. In the textbooks, when they're talking about hand contact, they say that's the direct route. I'm doing this for this report because I'm trying to make sense for everybody's that there are intermediary steps, and that's really rather important. So the direct contact, say, touching someone's hand or touching something, I suppose. If someone kissed someone, that could be a very direct route, but that's a very, intimate. I don't know where to go with that one, really. But we'll leave that at this moment.
Yeah.
But I'm blushing now at this. I can see this here.
I don't think kissing got banned. Did it?
I don't know. Well, what happened in the home stays in the home, I suppose. Yeah. But the point is, it's the idea, the classic of the textbooks would say, the classic of the indirect and two indirect routes, as I've classified here. With the hands, the classic one would be, hello, you cough into your hand, you shake hands with someone else, they then take it and they rub their eye or their nose or something. Or with the fomite, that would be, you cough into your hand, you touch the door handle, you walk away, someone else then touches the door handle, then they do that.
So that is what is meant by fomite?
That's fomite, yes.
And can I take it that where you're dealing with indirect transmission, viral material is lost through degradation?
Yes, every time you touch those, so let's take the door handle, that's a great one to do. So even when you cough and you cover your hands, not all the virus went onto your hands.
Yep.
And the hands actually aren't very good at porous surfaces, and hands tend to kill the virus. Doesn't last for very long. So whatever goes onto the hands then has to be transferred to it's lost something there. It goes to the door handle, it's lost some more. And then the next person to touch the door handle doesn't necessarily touch them straight away. They might wait an hour.
Yeah.
And in that time, it's degraded over time. The then person touches it, it loses them. And in fact, I think it was Raymond Tellier did some analysis and reckoned that only about 1% of it eventually gets to the target, if it does get to the target. So it really is degraded. And so time is a very key important thing in there.
Now, clearly, though, when you're talking about direct contact, it goes, you cough in my face effectively.
Very short.
Yeah, exactly. That's the point.
So the virus is fitter,
Yeah.
and it hasn't been through any intermediary steps.
Okay. So survival time depends on the surfaces, how porous, all of the other ways in which it can degrade that you've just told us about.
Fully understood initially, but later on, many studies have shown that the porous and hands and things, it doesn't survive that well on it. But hand washing is really good, by the way. So don't,
Well, that actually was going to bring me on to, I think you said in your report that the fomite transmission touching the inanimate object and indeed contact transfer plays a role, but the precise proportion of that is not yet known. Is that correct?
Yes, in my opinion. At the beginning of the pandemic, it was thought to be much more important than later on, but I'm sure clinical witnesses will tell you the same thing. As it went on, it got downplayed, and it certainly the fomite and the contact. And so less emphasis was on that and more was on the droplet. So I think it does make a contribution, but I don't think we understand how much of a contribution. But I would say it's a significant but minor contribution. Right. That's my personal opinion.
Right. I think you did say in your report at paragraph 105, though, and you made the point that the precise proportion of fomite and contact transmission that plays a role is not known, but the IPC people, by which you mean those drafting the guidance, and public health assumed it to play a greater contribution, whilst Airborne certainly initially was considered to be an unlikely.
Yeah, well, I always like to kind of quote higher authorities than myself, right? And the PIP report, which is the Pandemic Influenza Preparedness Report from 2011, there was two of them, and there you see it in 105. It's since the role of hands in the transmission has actually never been demonstrated epidemiologically, one may hesitate to attribute great proportion to this pathway. That was the epidemiological evidence is not that strong, to be honest.
All right. Can I,
for this,
perhaps before we break for lunch, I want to deal with one other topic, if I may, my lady, and it's to look at some of the other terminology that is used, and then perhaps after lunch we can look at some of the historical controversy and assumptions that played out, in particular, in the IPC guidance. So, Professor, can I ask you this? I think you were shown a statement by Lisa Ritchie, and it will be in your bundle behind tab 3. Now, she was the chair of the IPC cell, made up of a number of individuals, and obviously it wasn't proportionate for the inquiry to speak to all of them.
Yep.
And so although she is the front person, I want it to be made abundantly clear that she's often speaking on behalf of the cell's position. Occasionally she speaks to her own position, and we'll deal with that when we hear from her. But can I just ask you about some of the terminology that she uses, whether you agree with it, and see where we end up just before our lunch break? And could you turn, please, to page 13? And if we put it on screen, it's INQ 421939_13. Because we're, I hope, a bit more familiar now with some of the language. And there may be a divergence here. And if we look at droplet transmission, there the statement sets out that droplet transmission involves droplets of 5 microns to about 200 in diameter from another person's, infected person's respiratory tract reaching the eyes, nose, mouth of another person. And then it sets out large droplets greater than 20 microns typically fall to the floor within a metre. And large droplets, she says at the bottom of paragraph 43, fall to the ground within seconds, while smaller droplets, 5 to 20, can stay airborne for several minutes. Now, just pause. You have told us about the distinction between 100 microns, and now we're introducing much smaller figures. And I want to try and understand what you say about droplet transmission, firstly, involving droplets of 5 microns to about 200 microns in diameter. Is that a range of diameter with which you're familiar and with which you would agree?
I disagree with it, but I am familiar with it, if that makes sense. May I just elucidate one thing?
Yes, of course.
Earlier on in your questioning, earlier on in the first session, you asked me about the 100 microns, and I said there was 2 schools of thought, and I went down the engineering physics, which I believe is the correct one because it's dealing with the physics, which is well established and has been established for about 150 years, certainly 100 years in this situation since the 1930s. The other branch is the medics and the IPC branch, and this represents that. And we'll see it in the next session, they had this 5 micron demarcation. They didn't actually say 200 microns, but that's a good upper limit, it's not bad. But that 5 microns, they said anything bigger than that was a droplet. So I'm familiar, I've seen this many times in many things, but as far as I'm concerned, that has no basis in physics. It's completely arbitrary, that first statement there. Certainly, they do go up to 200 microns, and they certainly are in the 500 microns, but they're not droplets. Those are below 100, those are aerosols.
Right. So,
but they can reach the eyes and...
Yes, that bit,
yeah,
there's no dispute with, but from your evidence, if I understand you correctly, droplet is referring to microns 100 plus.
Yes.
Aerosols lower than 100.
As in that diagram,
Right,
which
fine.
we saw earlier on, Wang's diagram.
Do we need to look at the paragraph 43 referencing large droplets greater than 20 microns now being introduced, typically falling to the ground?
It's just not true. It's
Right.
not true. In fact, I can tell you what a 25 micron particle, which is larger than that, right? It's factually incorrect. That will take to fall out of the air about 1.3 minutes from a height of a standing height. And remember, that's in still air, not in air. And that has a descending velocity, according to Stokes' law, of 2.5 centimetres per second. Bear in mind that the average air velocity in this room is in the region of 15 to 25 centimetres per second, that type of order. These particles, in those 1 minute, they will travel much further, can potentially travel further than a metre, especially if they're entrained into a
So there is a divergence here between the physicists, if I may put it like that, and the clinicians. And I want to try and understand, why is it important in terms of infection prevention control measures?
Well, if you feel that a particle, so say most particles are in that kind of smaller range, if you feel that they're but above 5 microns, if you think that that's a droplet and doesn't go more than a metre, which is the classic viewpoint, and I'm not saying that's here necessarily said quite like this, but the classic textbook says that a particle greater than 5 microns doesn't go more than a metre, then if you stand 1.5 meters, 2 meters away, socially distanced, you think, well, all the droplets will fall on the floor, and you're not taking into account the aerosol that will be inhaled, especially both in the near field and in the far field. So you don't think the aerosols are important, basically, especially if you don't believe that the virus is in them, which we now know the virus is in those things. Also, I should say, you would be recommending a surgical mask.
Right.
Because you'd be trying to stop droplets and not being too concerned about the aerosols, if that was the case.
So, do I understand this correctly? The size of the droplet can determine not only the size of the particle can determine not only how far it can go, but the type of IPC measure that might be required by the healthcare worker in terms of masks and other bits of PPE they might need to wear to help protect them.
Yes.
All right. Okay. We briefly turn to the next page in the statement and just deal with Airborne. And they're set out is for the purposes of Miss Ritchie's statement. What she says about airborne transmission involves the infectious particles in a respirable size range that can remain suspended in the air for long periods and be dispersed by air currents over distances greater than 1 metre.
Right. Can I just say,
Yes.
to clarify, a respirable size actually has a strict definition in the well, it's interpreted as less than 5 microns generally. Right. That's the demarcation.
Thank you.
Certainly in the PIP report, that's there. It's the demarcation between the particles that go deeper into the lungs and stay higher up. So 5 microns is generally, it's not stated here, but that would be the kind of size there. Right. So, sorry.
It's all right. So, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought there. The airborne transmission involves infectious particles in the respirable size range that can remain suspended in the air for long periods and be dispersed by air currents over distances greater than 1. Do you agree with that summary in that paragraph? Or put another way, do you think
Yeah, no, I agree with it, but I would say that particles over 5 microns can also do that as well, can go further than...
Fine. Now, she refers in the statement to short-range transmission and long-range. You've told us about near-field and far-field. So, again, the terminology not necessarily being on all fours. Set out here is short-range aerosol transmission involves tiny respiratory droplets, less than 10 microns, that can spread over short distances less than 2 metres. Do you agree with that?
I disagree with that.
Why?
Right. Because a 10-micron particle in still air will take 8 minutes to drop 2 metres, right, to fall out of the air. So, sorry, 8 minutes, sorry, I should have said, right? So 8 minutes, air can move, and that's in still air, it can move a lot further. So a 10-micron particle, so particles less than 10 microns are going to obviously travel short distances, but they'll travel a lot further than the short distances. Yeah, so I think this says can spread over short distances less than that. The implication being there that it can only travel over less than short distances. No, it can't. It can travel over short distances and long distances. In fact, that's been known about for years. I'm sorry, but, back in Wells's work in the 1930s on TB, they were talking about that going.
Long-range transmission, I suspect you've just dealt with, and there is set out at paragraph 49. It's her view that the distinction between a respiratory aerosol and a droplet in terms of size is an academic consideration that cannot usefully be applied in national guidance. Now, can I make it clear, this is not a them and us.
Yeah, I know.
All right, there is a genuine divergence here between the physicists and perhaps the clinicians. So please don't misunderstand that, the position. But I just want you to help us with your view about some of these terms and indeed some of the IPC measures that might flow from the terminology.
Right. I will. I'm not trying to do a them and us at all. I'm trying, really trying to help here. I'm smiling because it just highlights the difference of opinions.
Exactly.
Right. Right. So I want to say straight up, I work with clinicians, but I am not a clinician. You know that. But I have utter respect for clinicians, and I see how they deal with patients all the time. And so, from an infection prevention control background, which is this person is talking from, they're having to deal with a whole load of practical things. My answer to this is it's not an academic. It's a
Why?
Because it's really important to understand how infection is transmitted, how viruses are transmitted. Because if you want to develop interventions, you need to know how it's transmitted, and you need to know kind of the relative importance of various routes. And then you can develop optimum strategies to minimize that, to mitigate that. And sometimes you might say, we don't have to measure the particles, we don't have to measure the sizes or the things that are put down here. What we what we need to do is understand it. Then we can take measures that help to mitigate the transmission. That's why it's important to understand. So I don't believe it is an academic issue.
And my lady, may we pause there? I referred to her as Miss Ritchie. She's Dr. Ritchie. I meant no disrespect. I'm sorry about that. But would that be a convenient moment?
Of course. 5 to 2.
Thank you.
All rise.